Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Cynthia, Red Lucy, Diane, David, Anne, and Humphrey. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including collections by topic and exclusive episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight we're continuing a month of listener requests with another new book. Let's relax with the architecture of country houses, including designs for cottages, farmhouses, and villas, with remarks on interiors, furniture, and the best modes of warming and ventilating, with 320 illustrations. By A.J. Downing, author of Designs for Cottage Residences, Hints to Persons About Building, etc. First published in 1851 by D. Appleton and Company, 200 Broadway, New York. Let's begin. To Henry Winthrop Sargent, Esquire, of Wodeneth-on-the-Hudson, with the sincere regard of the author. Preface. There are 3 excellent reasons why my countrymen should have good houses. The first is because a good house, and by this I mean a fitting, tasteful, and significant dwelling, is a powerful means of civilization. A nation whose rural population is content to live in mean huts and miserable hovels is certain to be behind its neighbors in education, the arts, and all that makes up the external signs of progress. With the perception of proportion, symmetry, order, and beauty awakens the desire for possession, and with them comes that refinement of manners which distinguishes a civilized from a coarse and brutal people. So long as men are forced to dwell in log huts and follow a hunter's life, we must not be surprised at lynch law and the use of the bowie knife. But when smiling lawns and tasteful cottages begin to embellish a country, we know that order and culture are established. And as the first incentive towards this change is awakened in the minds of most men by the perception of beauty and superiority in external objects, it must follow that the interest manifested in the rural architecture of a country like this has much to do with the progress of its civilization. The second reason is because the individual home has a great social value for a people. whatever new systems may be needed for the regeneration of an old and enfeebled nation, we are persuaded that, in America, not only is the distinct family the best social form, but those elementary forces which give rise to the highest genius and the finest character may, for the most part, be traced back to the farmhouse and the rural cottage. It is the solitude and freedom of the family house in the country which constantly preserves the purity of the nation and invigorates its intellectual powers. The battle of life carried on in cities gives a sharper edge to the weapons of character, but its temper is, for the most part, fixed amid those communings with nature and the family, where individuality takes its most natural and strongest development. The third reason is because there is a moral influence in a country home. When among an educated, truthful, and refined people, it is an echo of their character, which is more powerful than any mere oral teachings of virtue and morality. That family, whose religion lies away from its threshold, will show but slender results from the best teachings, compared with another where the family hearth is made a central point of the beautiful and the good, and much of that feverish unrest and want of balance between the desire and the fulfillment of life is calmed and adjusted by the pursuit of tastes which result in making a little world of the family home, where truthfulness, beauty, and order have the largest dominion. The mere sentiment of home with its thousand associations has, like a strong anchor, saved many a man from shipwreck in the storms of life. How much the moral influence of that sentiment may be increased by making the home all that it should be, and how much an attachment is strengthened by every external sign of beauty that awakens love in the young, are so well understood that they need no demonstration here. All to which the heart can attach itself in youth and the memory linger fondly over in riper years contributes largely to our stock of happiness and to the elevation of the moral character. For this reason, the condition of the family home, in this country where every man may have a home, should be raised, till it shall symbolize the best character and pursuits, and the dearest affections and enjoyments of social life. After the volumes I have previously written on this subject, it is needless for me to add more on the purpose of this work, but it is perhaps proper that I should say that it is rather intended to develop the growing taste of the people than as a scientific work on art. Rural architecture is indeed so much more a sentiment and so much less a science than civil architecture, that the majority of persons will always build for themselves, and unconsciously throw something of their own character into their dwellings. To do this well and gracefully, and not awkwardly and clumsily, is always found more difficult than is supposed. I have therefore written this volume in the hope that it may be of some little assistance to the popular taste. For the same reason, I have endeavored to explain the whole subject in so familiar a manner as to interest all classes of readers who can find anything interesting in the beauty, convenience, or fitness of a house in the country. A.J.D. Newburgh on the Hudson, June 1850. The Architecture of Country Houses, Part 1. Cottages and Farmhouses. Country Houses, Section 1. On the Real Meaning of Architecture. Certainly, the national taste is not a matter of little moment. Whether another planet shall be discovered beyond Leverrier's may or may not affect the happiness of a whole country, but whether a young and progressive people shall develop ideas of beauty, harmony, and moral significance in their daily lives, whether the arts shall be so understood and cultivated as to elevate and dignify the character, whether the country homes of a whole people shall embody such ideas of beauty and truth as shall elevate and purify its feelings, these are questions of no mean or trifling importance. Now, the real progress which a people makes in any of the fine arts must depend on the public sensibility and the public taste. Sensibility to beauty must exist, and there must be some means afforded of developing and cultivating the taste, for however instinctive and natural a gift the former may be, a correct taste is only the result of education. The feeling must be guided by the judgment. While a general ignorance on the subject of architecture among us must be admitted, we must also avow that the liveliest interest in it is now strongly felt on all sides, and this very ignorance is mainly owing to the dry and barren manner in which architects have usually written on the real meaning or philosophy of their art. It would seem that men who work out beautiful thoughts in ponderous stone seldom wield so slight an implement as a pen with grace and power. Why else should 9/10 of even the educated believe that the whole circle of architecture is comprised in the 5 orders, or at most that a Greek temple and a Gothic cathedral are the alpha and omega of the art? Why should so many of the most intelligent persons imagine that domestic architecture is only perfect when it is similar to that of public edifices, or at least when it borrows all its ornaments from such structures? It is not an easy task to lay bare the principles of an art compounded thus of the useful and the beautiful, to show how and why it appeals so powerfully to the whole nature of man, to his senses, his heart, and his understanding. But it is perhaps this very compound nature of architecture, this appeal which it makes to the sensation, the sentiment, and the knowledge of man, which has left it in so unsatisfactory a shape to the popular apprehension, which has caused it to be looked upon by some as the mere province of the builder, by others as the object of enthusiastic admiration, and by the rest as a subject of scientific investigation, until half the world imagines the beauty of an edifice, like genius, to be a happy accident, to be enjoyed when found, but as difficult to seize as the rainbow itself. It would be a boon to the age if some gifted artist would show the world the secret sources of the influence which architecture wields in all civilized nations. This is as far beyond our province as our ability. Still, we must be indulged in a brief analysis of the elements of interest which architecture possesses for the human mind, and a glance at the partially concealed sources of that power which it exerts over our hearts and understandings. Something of this kind seems to us to be demanded by the inquiring mind and the expanding taste of our people, and domestic architecture itself, which, amid the louder claims of civil and ecclesiastical art, has been too much neglected, seems to demand a higher consideration in a country where the ease of obtaining a house and land, and the ability of almost every industrious citizen to build his own house, constitute a distinctive feature of national prosperity. The useful in architecture. The senses make the first demand in almost every path in human life. The necessity of shelter from the cold and heat, from sun and shower, leads man at first to build a habitation. What this habitation shall be depends partly on the habits of the man, partly on the climate in which he lives. If he is a shepherd and leads a wandering life, he pitches a tent. If he is a hunter, he builds a rude hut of logs or skins. If he is a tiller of the soil, he constructs a dwelling of timber or stones, or lodges in the caverns of the rocky hillsides. As a mere animal, man's first necessity is to provide shelter, and as he is not governed by the constructive instinct of other animals, the clumsiest form which secures him against the inclemency of the seasons often appears sufficient. There is scarcely any design apparent in its arrangement, and the smallest amount of convenience is found in its interior. This is the first, primitive or savage idea of building. Let us look a step higher in the scale of improvement. On the eastern borders of Europe is a tribe or nation of the Slavonic people, called the Croats, who may be said to be only upon the verge of civilization. They lead a rude forest and agricultural life. They know nothing of the refinements of the rest of Europe. They live in coarse, yet strong and warm houses, but their apartments are as rude as their manners, and their cattle frequently share the same rooms with themselves. Our third example may be found in any portion of the United States. It is nothing less common than a plain, rectangular house built of timber from the forest sawmill, with a roof to cover it, windows to light it, and doors to enter it. The heat is kept out by shutters, and the cold by fires burnt in chimneys. It is well and strongly built. It affords perfect protection to the physical nature of man, and it serves, so far as a house can serve, all the most imperative wants of the body. It is a warm, comfortable, convenient dwelling. It is easy to see that in all these grades of man's life, and the dwellings which typify them, only one idea has as yet manifested itself in his architecture, viz., that of utility. In the savage, the half-civilized, and the civilized states, the idea of the useful and the convenient differ, but only in degree. It is still what will best serve the body, what will best shelter, lodge, feed, and warm us, which demands the whole attention of the mere builder of houses. It would be as false to call only this architecture as to call the gamut music, or to consider rhymes poetry, and yet it is the framework or skeleton on which architecture grows and wakens into life, without which, indeed, it can no more rise to the dignity of a fine art than perfect language can exist without sounds. There are also certain principles which belong to building, as the useful part of architecture is properly called, which are of the utmost importance, since they may not be in the slightest degree violated without proving more or less destructive to the enjoyment of the finest work. Many of these are mechanical principles involved in masonry, in carpentry, and other kinds of artisanship, which are sufficiently familiar in their nature to the general reader, and are subjects of technical expertness on the part of those employed in building. But there are also other principles besides these, which govern the workmen in their labors, and which must always control even him who only aims at the useful in architecture. The first and most obvious of these rules of utility is that the cost of the building shall not exceed the means of the owner or occupant. Out of a want of practical knowledge in the builder grow not unfrequently mistakes that are fatal to the use of a house, since if too much is expended in the whole structure, the owner may be forced to sell it to another rather than enjoy it himself. If too much is expended on a part, the economy necessary in the remainder may render parts of the house uncomfortable from defects in their construction. The second rule governs the quality of the materials and workmanship employed in the construction. That the materials should be of the soundest and best quality in the best edifices, and of ample strength and durability for the end in view, even in those of the humblest class, is a rule which may never be for a moment violated by the builder without injury to the structure. Nature here, as always, must be constantly respected, or she punishes severely all infringements of her laws. A wall that is not perpendicular, a foundation that is not firm, a roof that is not tight, a chimney that smokes, sooner or later, but inevitably, shows the builder's want of comprehension or respect for the laws of gravitation or the atmosphere, and impairs or destroys the usefulness of all architecture. The last and highest rule of utility is that which involves convenience. In all architecture, adaptation to the end in view is important. In domestic architecture, it is a principle which, in its influence on our daily lives, our physical comfort and enjoyment, is paramount and imperative. Hence, however full of ornament or luxury a house may be, if its apartments do not afford that convenience, comfort, and adaptation to human wants which the habits of those who are to live in it demand, it must always fail to satisfy us, or to merit the approval of the most matter-of-fact critic. Such a house may be compared to a column with well-molded shaft and richly decorated capital, but composed of such flimsy material that it will bear no weight, or to a person whose education has been that of accomplishments, with a total neglect of solid acquirements. This practical part of architecture involves more particularly what is called the plan of a building, providing apartments for the various wants of domestic and social life, adapting the size of such apartments to their respective uses, and all other points which the progress of modern civilization has made necessary to our comfort and enjoyment within doors. The illustration of these points will be found to a considerable extent in the treatment of the various designs which follow. It may be remarked, however, that no absolute rules for guidance can be laid down here. Domestic life varies not only in different countries, but even in different portions of a territory, so broad as that of the United States. Even different families have somewhat various habits, and therefore require different accommodations. The ingenuity and talents of the architect must therefore be put in full activity, even to meet the requirements of this humblest platform of his art. And we may add that it is a proof of weakness rather than strength to treat with the slightest neglect this its wholly utilitarian side. To the majority of mankind, the useful is the largest satisfaction derived from architecture, and while an able architect will always treat the materials placed in his hands for a new design so as to give something of the expression of beauty even to the simplest forms, he must never imagine that in his art he can largely neglect the useful for the beautiful. As in the Apollo, every muscle must be found which enters into the body of the hardiest day laborer, so in all perfect architecture no principle of utility will be found sacrificed to beauty, but only elevated and ennobled by it. The beautiful in architecture. We have shown as yet only the useful in architecture. At least we have endeavored to show how an edifice may combine fitness in all respects, how it may be strong, well built, warm, comfortable, and convenient, and no more. To attain this, there is no need of its displaying any appreciable grace, harmony, or beauty. Nay, it may be even faulty in its proportions and unpleasing in effect. Such examples are, in fact, every day before us. Buildings which completely answer the useful requirements of man, and yet give not a ray of pleasure or satisfaction to his heart or understanding. And yet there are persons who, because the useful and the beautiful in some arts may be most intimately combined, imagine that they are identical. This is the grossest error, of which, if the commonplace buildings we have just quoted are not a sufficient refutation, abundant others may be drawn every day from the works of nature or art. A head of grain, one of the most useful of vegetable forms, is not so beautiful as a rose. An ass, one of the most useful of animals, is not so beautiful as a gazelle. A cotton mill, one of the most useful of modern structures, is not so beautiful as the Temple of Vesta, yet no one thinks of comparing them for utility. The truth then is undeniable, that the beautiful is intrinsically something quite distinct from the useful. It appeals to a wholly different part of our nature. It requires another portion of our being to receive and enjoy it. There are many to whose undeveloped natures the useful is sufficient, but there are also not a few who yearn with an instinct as strong as for life itself for the manifestation of a higher attribute of matter, the beautiful. We have said that the useful in architecture is based wholly on the physical wants of man, that it is a response to the demand of our senses. We may also add that the beautiful is an original instinct of the sentiment of our nature. It is a worship by the heart of a higher perfection manifested in material forms. To see, or rather to feel, how in nature matter is ennobled by being thus touched by a single thought of beauty, how it is almost deified by being made to shadow forth, even dimly, his attributes, constitutes the profound and thrilling satisfaction which we experience in contemplating the external works of God. To be keenly sensible of the power of even the imperfect reproduction of such ideas in the various fine arts, poetry, music, painting, sculpture, architecture, etc., is to acknowledge the power of beauty over our feelings in another and a more personal form. To desire to surround ourselves with such sources of enjoyment, rather than to be content with mere utility, is only to acknowledge the existence of a sentiment which, next to the religious one, is the purest and noblest part of our nature. Looking at the subject before us, it must be admitted that if it is a step forward in civilization to separate ourselves from our cattle, rather than share our apartments with them like the Croats, it is a much higher step to evince, by the beauty of our architecture, that our hearts are alive to some of the highest emotions of which they are capable. What is beauty in architecture? In order to rid ourselves of the vague and indefinite meaning which hangs about this part of our subject like a thick mist in the minds of most persons, let us examine it somewhat closely. All beauty in architecture seems to us to resolve itself into two kinds, absolute and relative. Absolute beauty lies in the expression in material forms of those ideas of perfection which are universal in their application. We find them in nature as well as in art. We find them in the figures of the heavenly bodies, in the orbits of planets, in drops of water, in animal forms, in the growth of trees, in the structures of crystals. This proves not only that they are divine in their origin, but that they pervade all time and space. These typical ideas of beauty are proportion, symmetry, variety, harmony, and unity. They may be called abstract ideas of beauty of form and apply to all the arts, as well as to everything in nature, to a symphony of Beethoven or a statue by Powers, as well as to the sublime curve of Niagara or the varied outlines of the Alps. In order that the uninitiated reader may be able to analyze and understand these universal ideas of beauty, let us look at them architecturally. A fundamental idea of the beautiful in architecture is proportion. Proportion in material objects is the relation of individual parts to the whole. Mr. Ruskin has cleverly defined it to be the sensible relation of quantities. In all the arts, it is the realization of the most perfect idea of the height, breadth, outline, and form of the object aimed at, and therefore involves the highest single feeling of pure material beauty. In architecture, proportion is shown first in the composition of the outline or mass of the entire building. If endowed with this quality, it will neither be too long nor too broad, too low nor too high. It will exhibit to the eye at a glance that nice relation of all the parts to each other and to the whole, which gives to that whole the stamp of the best, most suitable and perfect form. Proportion may be shown in the smallest building as well as in the largest, in a cottage of 20 feet as well as in St. Peter's of 10 acres. In the former, however, it is much more simple, as it involves only the height and breadth of a few parts. In the latter, it is evolved by the skillful grouping of many parts. Hence, in large piles of buildings, the central mass is raised up in a dome-like or pyramidal form, not only for the sake of making a whole, but also to give that proportion of the whole which great extent and the multiplication of parts renders necessary. But proportion does not merely govern the form of the whole mass in architecture. It descends into the smallest details. It demands that the height of a room, of a window or a door, should accord with its breadth and length. The minutest object, the smallest details, are equally capable of expressing it. It applies as well to the form of a cornice, a molding, or an ornament, as to the whole outline of the edifice itself. Proportion in architecture has been aptly likened by a German writer to time in music, that measure which confers a completeness of form on the entire melody. And though the parallel cannot be carried so closely as to enable us strictly to agree with Madame de Staël, who called architecture frozen music, the illustration is scarcely less forcible. That proportion is one of those qualities of beauty most universally felt, it does not require any argument of ours to prove. The immediate delight which all persons experience in a well-proportioned human figure, a statue, or a Grecian column is well known. That this is quite independent of education, that it only requires sensibility to beauty, is equally true. Hence the want of proportion in a building is felt as a great and irremediable defect at the first glance by many who are totally ignorant of architecture as an art, and hence, if absent, it is a fundamental want, for which no decoration, no style, no beauty of parts, however excellent in themselves, can ever wholly compensate. One would suppose that some definite rules would have been deduced for the production of so fundamental a quality as this in architecture, but no such rules exist at the present day, and its production seems to depend mainly on the genius of the artist. That education and study of the best examples will aid in the appreciation of it is undoubtedly true, but the many blunders in proportion which the works of modern artists exhibit prove that it is one of the qualities of beauty less vividly felt and less easily produced than any other at the present time. Symmetry is that quality of beauty in material objects which may be defined, that balance of opposite parts necessary to form an agreeable whole. Thus in the human figure, it is the joining of the opposite sides, each with its separate limbs, which makes the whole symmetrical. If an arm is wanting, the symmetry is destroyed. In trees, it is seen in the balance of the opposite sides of their heads. If a large limb is cut away, the balance is lost. In architecture, it is the arrangement on each side of a center of two parts that balance each other, and that do not make a whole without this center. Hence the superior effect of a building which is a plain cube with a wing on each side over a cube without wings. The wings raise the character of the form from uniformity to symmetry. This leads us to remark here that regularity and uniformity, two qualities common in architecture, are often classed as distinct elements of beauty in themselves. They may be such, in an artistical point of view, as denoting the presence of art, but they are in fact only primary steps towards symmetry, which comprehends them both. A regular building in architecture is one in which a given form is repeated at regular distances, such as a square house, in which the same windows and doors are repeated at regular intervals, or a long row of houses in a street, in which the same general forms are regularly repeated. A uniform building is one in which the same forms are repeated on all sides, as a cubical house with the same windows all round, or a block formed of two or more houses exactly alike and placed side by side. Symmetry involves something more. It asks for a central part which shall connect the two other parts into a whole, and thereby make something involving a more complete idea than regularity and uniformity. Thus, Design 6 is a symmetrical cottage, from the front of which neither the central part nor the sides can be taken away without destroying the composition as a whole. The difference between this and a regular or uniform building of the same length is that the latter might be divided into several parts, each of which is equally regular and uniform, and therefore as complete in itself as the whole building. Symmetry is one of the greatest beauties in all architecture. The author of Modern Painters conceives it to be the symbol of abstract justice, and certainly in material forms, when joined to proportion, it conveys at once an idea of completeness of form which gives universal satisfaction. The Grecian temples owe to these two elements their great and lasting power over the human mind for so many ages, for it is a beauty which may be bestowed on a cottage, a villa, or indeed any kind of building, and as it is one which appeals intuitively to every mind, it is never neglected by artists who wish to impress the beautiful upon their works. Symmetry is quite distinct from proportion. It is only necessary to remember that it is a balance made between opposite parts, and that proportion is the relation between all the parts, to comprehend it more clearly. Thus, a statue may be perfectly symmetrical on all sides, and yet too short or too high in its proportions. The central part of a symmetrical building, like that in Design 6, might be raised or lowered several feet without injuring the symmetry of the composition, though the proportion would be at once destroyed. It has been justly said that though symmetry is not the highest quality of beauty, yet no object can be perfectly beautiful without it. Hence, in many beautiful objects, where from the nature of the structure or purposes, exact or regular symmetry is impossible, a certain balance must be found before they can give full satisfaction. There are then in nature and art two kinds of symmetry, that which is regular and strikes us at a glance, and that of a poplar or fir tree, whose limbs are equal on all sides of the head, and that which is irregular, such as we see in a spreading oak, with branches unequal, but forming altogether a head which is equally symmetrical with respect to the trunk. The strict application of the principle of a regular balance of parts, as it would be deduced from our remarks, would prevent our finding any symmetry in all irregular buildings, but in fact this is not the case. The most irregular building, if composed by an artist of genius, will always evince symmetry. That is to say, it will form an outline in which there will be a central portion or point which unites two sides into one symmetrical whole, Two parts which, if they do not balance each other in exact forms and proportions as in regular symmetry, do balance in the general impression which they make on the eye, in the mass and grouping of the composition. The villas in designs 21 and 22 are examples of irregular symmetry and may be compared with the symmetrical villas in some of the other designs. Any building so irregular as not to show some recognition of this principle of irregular symmetry can never be called beautiful, though it may be strikingly odd or grotesque. We may remark here that buildings in an irregular style, highly expressive of irregular symmetry, are much more striking in a picturesque point of view, and are therefore preferred by many artists. They are more expressive of character and individuality, in other words, of relative beauty, than of abstract or universal beauty, and while they are perhaps not so agreeable to the universal mind, they are far more so to certain mental organizations. We may also add that irregular symmetry can rarely be expressed with much success in a small edifice. It requires considerable extent and the introduction of a variety of parts to enable one to introduce this quality in a manner altogether satisfactory in a dwelling of small size. For this reason, those cottages and small villas give the greatest pleasure, in which proportion and regular symmetry are the prevailing elements of beauty. Variety, though always a subordinate, is still an essential quality of absolute beauty. As in nature it gives richness and interest to landscape, to sky, to the vegetable and animal kingdoms, so in art it adds to the interest of the whole by the diversity which it affords in the arrangement, sizes, or forms of the different parts. In architecture, variety is of the greatest value, often preventing simple forms from degenerating into baldness or plain broad surfaces from being monotonous, by its power in the arrangement or the decoration of details, for it is in the details of regular and symmetrical buildings, such as the cornices, moldings, etc., that variety is chiefly to be introduced. In irregular buildings, there may also be variety in the various parts, projections, recesses, towers, etc. A slight difference in the forms, sizes, or decorations of certain parts of a building is sufficient to give it an expression of variety, and by the judicious employment of this quality, every architect is able to increase the beauty of his whole composition. But it should be remembered that in architecture, even more than in the other arts, it must be kept under the control of the judgment, since if carried to a great length, it leads to confusion, the result of which is always painful and destructive of all beauty. Intricacy, which is a complex sort of variety, is therefore to be avoided in domestic architecture, as likely to become wearisome and perplexing. And on that note of advice, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the architecture of country houses, which ended up being much more philosophical than I was expecting. Thank you so much for this excellent recommendation, which you can read for yourself at the Internet Archive, a link for which is included in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.bedtime.com. support@boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.